culture. If someone was feeling guilty for being a homosexual, he needed help to defy the religious prisms that controlled his thought patterns about homosexuality and were causing him to experience the guilt feelings. It is not that he was made in the image of God and therefore knew what was right and wrong, and that the guilt was as a result of instinctively knowing that he was wrong. Such a man needed himself and become his authentic self that I studied. Man is the captain of his own ship and the master of his own destiny. He needed not be accountable to some higher power. And something about this notion of freedom, authenticity, self-expression excited me. Something about it excited me, but it also scared me at the same time. I knew I was a very self-motivated person, and I was a self-starter without needing the encouragement or validation of others. On the other hand, the result of the boundaries I was brought up within, the rules and the laws, and even some of the limiting circumstances that had humbled me and kept me sober-minded and sane. Yet I could not help but think that with freedom to be whoever I wanted to be and do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it, life would be great. I often envied recluses. I often envied recluses because they had successfully defied societal rules and norms, and they were living on their own terms. Yet I enjoyed people. I loved my family. I loved friends. I felt so home in the company of others. Furthermore, I believe there was a God watching, a God to which all of us were accountable. There was heaven and there was hell, and I wanted to make it to heaven. I was brought up on hymns, and I started memorizing scripture verses when I was in high school. I wanted to have a relationship with God and often secretly envied those who seemed to have a vital relationship with him and were not ashamed to proclaim him. After 2 years in the military, one in the military hospital in Pretoria and another in the Institute for Aviation Medicine, also in Pretoria, I went into private practice. Within a very short time, my practice had become quite successful. I was a generalist. I saw adults, children, teenagers, and families. I carved a niche, especially with teenagers, in their so-called adolescent years. I think what made me popular was how I involved parents and refused to see teenagers without their parents involved. I thoroughly enjoyed the success and the financial reward that came with it because it allowed me to do other things that I enjoyed. I traveled quite a bit to other parts of the world. The hardest years of my career was at the military hospital. Not only did my best friend die suddenly in a car accident, soldiers were contracting HIV at a very alarming rate and were dying as a result of HIV and AIDS. The hospices were bursting at the seams because there were not enough of them. I felt my role as a psychologist restricted me. I wanted to plead with people to stop sleeping around. I wanted to give them hope. I wanted to give hope to the dying. But what hope was there really except to help someone who was hanging by the thread accept their fate? Who cares where they would spend eternity? I was so troubled and overwhelmed. I just knew there had to be more. But what I did not know. I got so desperate, standing by the bedside of someone that was just about to die. I knew that there was so much more. Soon I started feeling demoralized and unhappy and ashamed of the work I was doing. This mainly because of the following reasons. Number one, patients or clients that I had treated successfully were coming back a year or two later. Although often the presentation would be different, the underlying issue was the same. For example, someone who came earlier with the problem of lack of confidence or low self-esteem and was being treated like a doormat by others now experiences rejection and sabotage from those he encountered. What do you think happened? This person has replaced one idol with another. Previously, it was pity and niceness so that they would be liked and accepted and adored. And now he's demanding respect. He's become arrogant and he wants to always get his way. Same person, different manifestation of the idol, which is self. The second thing that I realized was the majority of people I was seeing had a history of psychological or psychiatric admission or consultation. This means that our patients were moving from one psychologist to another. And when that happens, it means that they're not happy with the previous psychologist or psychiatrist. That discouraged me a lot. But also, I was growing in my Christian walk, and I started to see tensions between what I believed as a psychologist and what I believed as a Christian. Are self-direction and self-fulfillment really the goals I should help people toward? Is the pursuit of feeling better about self and life? And I found it was very difficult to disentangle humanistic and natural philosophies from the practice of psychology. And there were a lot of financial rewards, so I felt stuck. Fast forward a few years later, I went to seminary. My world came crumbling down when I got to seminary. Pastor Andrew, the one that spoke about before me, was easily one of my favorite lecturers. But there was a problem. He taught biblical counseling. Biblical counseling challenged my entire worldview. I spent my life building this empire. I was doing radio for about 4 stations. I had a TV show and I was writing articles for some magazines. And on top of that, I was raking in a lot of money. And I was loving on Jesus by the grace of God, faithfully serving in my charismatic church, peaceable with everybody. And you tell me that my worldview is wrong? Piece by piece, the Lord started building, bit by bit, the Lord started building my conviction. And I just could not go on and practice in the manner that I was. I dropped the radio stations. I stopped my TV work. I stopped my practice. These are some of the schools that influenced me when I was at university. These are the schools that sort of shaped my thinking about the world, thinking about people, and thinking about problems in the world. The first one is psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. This is a theory of personality. It is premised upon 3 concepts referred to as the id, ID, the superego, and the ego. And these 3 concepts are waging war within a person. So as you're sitting here, according to Freud, there's war raging in your, which seek expression. You're not aware of these impulses and the drives that seek expression because they are on the subconscious level. But there is the superego. There is the superego. This is the second aspect of Freud's personality theory. You could refer to this as your conscience, the conscience of man. The superego is socialized into individuals by parents, by church, by teachers, by people that have got authority over an individual. And the superego is the problem. The superego is the culprit in the Freudian system. According to Freud, the problem with someone who's emotionally disturbed or someone who's mentally ill, the problem is that he has an over-socialized must, shoots, and ought. He must, he ought to, he should. So there is an over-socialization of the super ego. And then the third aspect of this personality is the ego, the ego. This is the arbiter. This is the conscious self. And this is how conflict arises within an individual. The id, the one that contains impulses and drives that are on the subconscious level, is feeling frustrated. So the id wants to express, or it seeks expression of these wants and desires that are on the subconscious level. But the superego keeps on saying, that's wrong, you must not, you must not. So there's the voice of the parents and the teachers and the religious system, the churches, that keeps saying, do not do this. And then comes the ego, which is the third aspect of this personality theory. It operates on the level quite different from the id and the superego. The ego functions on the level of responsibility, whereas the id and the superego function on the level of irresponsibility. So when the id is repressed by the superego, the person in conflict expresses what Freud calls guilt feelings. Guilt feelings, these feelings of guilt, however, are not feelings that stem from real guilt. Since his feelings of guilt is false, one does not need to confess any sin. Rather, he needs to rid himself of this falsehood that causes him to feel guilty. So, naturally, therapy or treatment consists of making one feel right by dispelling false guilt. The therapist achieves this by taking a stand with the id against the superego. He seeks to weaken or dilute the superego so that it stops making demands on the victims. Some of the techniques that psychoanalysis or the psychodynamic theory uses are ventilation. We usually use this language. I think all of us sitting here have used this language, that I've got pent up anger. I'm angry inside. I need to express this feeling of anger, or I need to express this feeling of frustration. So one of the techniques of the psychodynamic theory is to have a patient express this pent up anger, ventilate, and air whatever is inside. There's also hypnosis. Where one is put into a state of relaxation, and that is facilitated by the therapist. And questions are being asked, and the patient is able to remember stuff that are repressed and is able to freely express that which is repressed or that which is in the subconscious. And there's what they call the free association. So what happens is the patient lies on the couch and the therapist stands behind the patient and just let the patient speak whatever comes to their mind. And the therapist will analyze the things that the patient is speaking about, and sort of come up with themes from that kind of conversation. I don't want to bore you with the details. You can find these things on the internet. And I don't think you necessarily have to memorize Freud's theory of personality. But I want you to know who Freud really is and what he really, really stood for. Some facts about him. He's famous for portraying religion, including Christianity, as a collective neurosis of mankind. He argued that religious beliefs give expression to wish-fulfilling illusions, serving the immature emotional needs of the child living on within the adult. Freud is famous for portraying religion as a collective neurosis of mankind. He argued that religious beliefs give expression to wish-fulfilling illusions, serving the immature emotional needs of the child living within the adult. Such illusions, he sternly maintained, should be cast aside and replaced by ideas corresponding to reality, namely the materialistic worldview that emerges gradually but inescapably from the cumulative process of scientific observation. So Freud denies, number one, the existence of God. He denies, obviously, the revelation of God. He denies the historical existence of Christ. He denies the incarnation and therefore his life, his death, and resurrection of Christ, which is the hope of believers. And yet, a lot of Christians unknowingly swear by Freud. Another person that influenced me was a gentleman called Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is the father of the humanistic therapeutic model called the person-centered therapy. In fact, Carl had gone to seminary. He had gone to Union Theological Seminary. He was brought up by conservative Christian parents. And when he got to seminary, he was taught by some liberal lecturers, and he sort of renounced Christianity. So he developed this model called the person-centered therapy. This was my favorite because it speaks about the non-judgmental attitude. I just hated people that judged others. I wanted freedom. I wanted people to have the freedom to live the way they wanted to live. So he comes up with this model, which is non-directive, comprises of empathy, just understanding people and being able to listen without giving people the sense of direction. So what he argues is all that you do is you provide an environment within which an individual that you're helping will find direction for themselves. I don't know if you probably have come across versions of client-centered therapy where you've been taught how to communicate, and they'll say things like, so someone says, I was driving and there was an accident and there was traffic, and then you listening and how you reflect on what they're saying, you say, it must be frustrating, so that they're able to grasp what it is that they're feeling, because sometimes these feelings are fleeting. And so you make them aware of what they're feeling. And as they do, they're discovering a way out of their problem or problems. But this is how Carl Rogers viewed people. Rather than viewing people as inherently flawed with problematic behaviors and thoughts that require treatment, person-centered therapy identifies that each person has the capacity and desire for personal growth and change. Rogers termed this natural human inclination the actualizing tendency or self-actualization, like Abraham Maslow. He likened it to the way that other living organisms strive towards balance, order, and greater complexity. So he had this picture of a plant that sort of grows towards the sun. And he says we've got a natural tendency to grow towards self-actualization, positivity, and so forth and so forth. According to Rogers, individuals have within themselves vast resources for self-understanding and for altering the self-concepts, basic attitudes, and self-directed behavior. These resources can be tapped if a definable climate of facilitative psychological attitudes can be provided. So your job as a counselor is to provide an environment within which the client can grow. The person-centered therapist learns to recognize and trust human potential, providing clients with empathy, unconditional positive regard to help facilitate change. Again, I don't want to bore you with the person-centered therapy. It's not going to help you. But I want to expose to you what this man or who this man is. This is a man that grew up in a Christian home, brought up by parents. So there's no doubt that he was rebelling against Christianity and the Bible. He was rebelling against the religion in which he was raised. He wrote a book, then it was really, really my favorite book. It was called On Becoming. It was written in 1954. And one of the things that he says is, experience is for me the highest authority. Experience is for me the highest authority. I don't even know how I forgot this because I used to memorize these things so I could rattle them off my head. Experience is for me the highest authority. The touchstone of validity is my own experience. No other person's ideas and none of my own ideas are as authoritative as my experience. It is to my experience that I must return again and again to discover a closer approximation to truth as it is in the process of becoming in me. And he continues, neither the Bible nor the prophets, neither Freud nor research, neither the revelations of God and man can take precedence over my own direct experience. So the highest authority is his own experience. I do believe that towards the end of his life, he had sort of started hallucinating. Those who wrote about him say he started believing in the transcendence of life. I don't know what that means, but I just think, you can't deny the existence of God and be normal. It's just impossible. Oh, by the way, going back to Freud died from some mouth cancer. And again, I'm not trying to be charismatic. Again, you can't defy God and just get away with it. I just think towards the end of his life, God shut him up. And in 1980, the same Carl Rogers. So the book that I quoted was written in 1954. But in 1980, he still holds the same, many years later, he still holds the same ideas. He says, people are just as wonderful as sunsets. I mean, listen to how poetic this is. And I think often you could read these things without even thinking about the implications of what these things mean. People are just as wonderful as sunsets if you let them be. When I look at a sunset, I don't find myself saying, soften the orange a bit on the right-hand corner. I don't try to control a sunset. I watch with awe as it unfolds. Anyway, the other one is cognitive behavioral therapy. The person behind this is a gentleman called Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck. I think cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most popular therapies right now. A lot of psychologists use it. In its simplest form, cognitive behavioral therapy argues that all psychological distress is the result of cognitive distortions, thinking distortions. All the psychological distress is as a result of our thinking. Bad thinking produces bad actions and feelings. Situations or events themselves do not cause suffering, but rather difficulties stem from an individual's cognitive evaluation. The way you perceiving reality is what causes problems. So cognitive behavioral therapy is therefore centered on changing an individual's thoughts, as right thinking will lead to right emotions and actions. Change is accomplished through a variety of interventions aimed at cognitive restructuring. So you're restructuring someone's thoughts. So pretty much the way distress comes because there's an illogical way of thinking about a situation, and because you're thinking about the situation illogically, it produces or it brings about distress. Some of the strategies will be your exposure therapy. For example, if you are afraid of cats, the therapist could systematically expose you to cats bit by bit, a few meters away from the cat, closer and closer, touch the cat, grab the cat, and then eventually, cuddle the cat or something like that. And also just challenging the way you're thinking about situations. At first glance, there does not seem to be any issue with this thing. The Bible does speak about bad thinking, and in theology, we often hear this phrase: "We must think the right thoughts after God," because a faulty perception of God results in lack of worship. I think I'm right. Yeah, lack of worship. It results in worshiping a God of your own imagination. So, like Pastor Andrew was giving us that theology, we need to know God for who He is, as the Bible presents Him. So there is a biblical support for the idea that interpretations are foundational for much human distress. Paul argues in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 that Christians so the cognitive content of resurrection in Christ modifies the manner in which Christians perceive the event of death. So the resurrection of Christ affects the way we think about death, and therefore affects the way we grieve. Similarly, Christians are to interpret potentially frightening situations in light of the sovereign care of God, Philippians 4:6-7. Paul argues that believers in Rome must be transformed by the renewing of their minds, Romans 12:2. So the Bible does establish that changing in thinking is essential to human transformation. But let's think about Adam and Eve. For example, take for instance Adam and Eve decision to rebel against God. Eve did know that for her own good she was not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent spoke. She saw that the fruit was delightful and desirable, and she ate. Similarly, Abraham knew that Yahweh had promised the covenant child would come from him, yet he insisted Sarah lie about her relationship to him because he was afraid that wicked men would kill him and take her. In Genesis 20. James chapter 4, verse 17 perhaps offers the clearest teaching that right thinking does not automatically lead to right decision. That you're thinking right does not mean that you'll make the right decisions. James 4:17, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Indeed, every sin by every believer follows this pattern. We know cognitively, we know what is right, and yet we do what is wrong. Cognitive theory, therefore, errs in its anthropology by establishing a hierarchy of functions of the heart where thinking takes precedence over everything else. Eve knew what was right but desired what was wrong. Abraham knew he would have a child and yet did evil because he was afraid. So James 4:17 implies that something else lies in the equation between thinking and doing, because simply knowing right does not guarantee doing right. I think Jonathan Edwards sort of helps us understand this argument better. He says, and as in worldly things, worldly affections are very much the spring of men's motion and action. So in religious matters, the spring of their action is very much religious affection. He that has doctrinal knowledge and speculation only without affection never is engaged in the business of religion, which means that the thinking, just the thinking only, cannot regulate our affections towards God. So we can do whatever we do, we can do right things without a love for God. And even when the right decision is taken without the love of God, that does not please God. So decisions, the right decisions that are being motivated here are decisions for self. They're not as a result of a love that derives from salvation from God. It is not particularly difficult to change people's actions. For example, if I put a gun to your head, you will be willing to do all kinds of things, right? If I put a gun to your head and I instruct you to do something, you can do that thing without necessarily wanting to do it. So making a decision does not mean that you love doing what you're doing. Let me give an example. That same gun to the head may compel, for example, a man who lives in Cape Town to say he loves blue bulls. But is that the truth? Is that the truth? Love cannot be changed by external forces alone. God has got to do some work. And here, Jonathan Edwards is helpful once again. Drawing on years of witnessing revival and transformation, he extends an observation. I am bold to assert that there never was any considerable change wrought in the mind or conversation of any person by anything of a religious nature that ever he read, heard, or saw that had not his affections moved. In order for people to change, every function of the heart must change. In order for people to change, every affection of the heart must change. But CBT cannot change the heart. There is nothing that's capable of changing a man's heart except God by his own Spirit. CBT aims to change people by changing their thoughts, by changing thoughts does not instill virtue according to Scripture. Biblical counseling aims at a deeper target. The goal of our instruction is love. After all, 1 Timothy 1:5, CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and biblical counseling are not siblings, or neither are they cousins. Rather, they are strangers that resemble one another only at a passing glance. Each is orientated around a different center from human change, and both cannot be right. I don't know how much time I... A lot of time. Okay, maybe 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I can use my second session. Okay. Okay. So in my second session, no, let me stop here. I think it just makes sense to stop here. But I think in my second session, what I will speak about is what's wrong with these systems. Why can't we embrace these systems? I mean, you get the gist of what's wrong already, but I just want to delve a little deeper into what's wrong with this. See you later.